My 5-year-old son called the emergency number and said, "Hurry, he's beating Mum." Millionaire CEO replied, "I'm coming." The child's voice came through the speaker at exactly 11:47 p.m., cutting through the static like a blade through silence. "Please, come. Please. He's hurting my mummy. There's blood. Please hurry." The dispatcher leaned forward, his veteran instincts kicking into gear. "What's your name, sweetheart? Can you tell me your name?" "Sean. My name is Sean Hill. My mummy is Betty. Please, he's going to kill her. I can hear her crying. She told me to hide. She always tells me to hide when he gets mad." In the shadows of the dispatch center, a man who had no business being there at this hour felt something crack inside his chest. Anthony Ward, billionaire CEO of Ward Industries, founder of the Hope Foundation, a man who had built an empire from nothing and lost the only person who mattered in the process, gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. The boy's breathing was rapid, terrified, punctuated by the sounds of chaos filtering through the phone. Glass breaking, a woman's muffled cry, a man's voice, slurred and dangerous, saying words that no child should ever have to hear. "You're doing so good, sweetheart," the dispatcher said, his voice steady despite the horror unfolding in his earpiece. "Help is on the way. Can you stay on the line with me? I'm trying to be very quiet. Mummy says when I'm quiet, the bad things go away faster. But they're not going away. He's so angry tonight. He found something on her computer, and now he won't stop." Anthony was already on his feet, pulling up the address on his tablet. Cedar Lane, a neighborhood 20 minutes from his current location. He checked the police dispatch screen and felt his stomach drop. Units delayed. Interstate pileup pulling resources. Estimated response time, 15 minutes minimum. 15 minutes. His sister had died in less time than that. "I'm going," Anthony said, grabbing his coat. Rodriguez, the dispatcher, turned with alarm in his eyes. "Sir, that's not protocol. We have units en route. You can't just—" "Protocol didn't save my sister." The words hung in the air, heavy with 4 years of grief and guilt that Anthony had never been able to outrun. Rodriguez fell silent because everyone at the Hope Foundation knew the story. Everyone knew why the billionaire sometimes appeared at odd hours, monitoring calls, searching for something he could never quite name. "Keep him on the line," Anthony said, already moving toward the door. "I'll be there in 12 minutes. He didn't wait for a response. The elevator seemed to take forever, each second stretching into an eternity while Sean's voice echoed in his mind. "She always tells me to hide when he gets mad." The weight of that word, always, settled into Anthony's bones. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a pattern. This was a child who had learned to survive violence the way other children learn to ride bikes. The Aston Martin roared to life in the underground garage, and Anthony tore out into the November night with a singular focus that had built empires and destroyed relationships. The phone connection stayed open through his car's speakers, Sean's voice filling the silence between Anthony's racing heartbeat. "Is someone really coming?" Sean whispered. "Sometimes Mummy says help is coming, but it never does." "Yes," Anthony said, his voice firm despite the chaos in his chest. "I promise you, Sean, I'm coming right now. Can you stay hidden for me? Can you stay very quiet and very still?" "I can do that. I'm good at hiding. I've been practicing my whole life." The casual devastation of that statement nearly made Anthony swerve off the road. 5 years old. This child was 5 years old, and he'd already learned that survival meant making himself invisible. "That's very brave of you, Sean. You're incredibly brave. What else can you tell me about where you are?" "Are you in your room?" "I'm in the closet. The one in the hallway. It has coats in it and it smells like Mummy's perfume. I have Gerald with me. He's my elephant. He's not scared because I told him not to be, but I think maybe he's a little scared anyway." Anthony blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. He couldn't afford to be emotional right now. He needed to be sharp, focused, ready for whatever he'd find when he arrived. "Gerald sounds like a very good friend. You keep holding on to him, okay? I'm only a few minutes away now." The GPS showed Cedar Lane approaching. 2.3 miles, then 1.8, then 1.2. "What's your name?" Sean asked suddenly, his voice small but curious despite the terror surrounding him. "Anthony. My name is Anthony." "Anthony. That's a good name. Are you a policeman?" "No, I'm not a policeman, but I help people. That's my job." "Like a superhero?" Something caught in Anthony's throat. No, buddy. Not like a superhero. Just a regular person who shows up when he can. Mummy says regular people don't show up. She says we're on our own. The pain in those words was almost unbearable. Anthony pressed the accelerator harder, watching the speedometer climb past anything that could be considered safe. Well, Sean, I'm going to prove your mummy wrong tonight. Because I'm showing up. I promise you that. The neighborhood materialized around him. Working-class homes, quiet streets, the kind of place where people minded their own business and closed their curtains against other people's problems. Porch lights were off. Windows were dark. No one coming to help. No one even aware that a child was hiding in a closet, whispering prayers into a phone while his mother fought for her life. Anthony screeched to a stop outside a modest 2-story house. The front door was slightly ajar, a detail that made his blood run cold. The man hadn't broken in. He'd been let in. He had access. He'd always had access. I'm here, Sean. I'm outside your house right now. I need you to stay hidden, okay? Don't come out until I tell you it's safe, okay? Anthony? Yes? Please help my mummy. She's the best mummy in the whole world. She makes me pancakes on Sundays, and she reads me stories about dragons, and she never yells at me even when I make messes. Please don't let the bad man hurt her anymore. I won't, Anthony promised, and in that moment, he meant it with every fiber of his being. I won't let him hurt her ever again. Before we go any further, I need to pause and speak directly to you. This story you're about to witness is not just entertainment. It's a reminder that some calls are meant to be answered. Some moments define us not by what we've accomplished, but by whether we showed up when it mattered. Have you ever felt that pull? That moment when something inside you says, this is important, this matters, this is what you're supposed to do? Maybe you've answered that call. Maybe you're still waiting for it. Maybe you've been the person hiding in the closet, praying someone would come. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that showing up for others is what separates existence from meaning, I need you to hit that like button right now. And if you've ever been the person who answered when no one else would, or the person who desperately needed someone to answer, type show up in the comments below. Because this is a story about what happens when a billionaire learns that all the money in the world can't buy the one thing he truly needs, a second chance to save someone he loves. Now let's go back to that house on Cedar Lane, where a man is about to break down a door and change 3 lives forever. Anthony moved toward the house with controlled urgency, years of self-defense training and raw adrenaline guiding his steps. He'd hired the best security experts money could buy after Miranda died, not to protect himself, but to prepare himself, to ensure that if he ever had the chance to do what he'd failed to do for his sister, he wouldn't fail again. The front door creaked as he pushed it open. The house was modest, lived in, with photos on the walls that showed a mother and son at beaches and birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Happy moments frozen in frames, standing in silent contrast to the sounds of violence echoing from deeper within. He moved through the living room, past a couch with worn cushions and a coffee table covered in children's drawings, past a bookshelf filled with paperbacks and picture books, past the evidence of a life that had been struggling to be normal despite whatever darkness lurked beneath the surface. The sounds led him to the kitchen. Betty Hill was on the floor, her arm bent at an unnatural angle, blood streaming from a cut above her eyebrow. She was conscious, barely, her eyes glazed with pain and terror and something that looked like resignation, like she'd known this night was coming, like she'd been waiting for it. Standing over her was a man who seemed to fill the room with his rage. Thick-necked, mean-eyed, his fists still clenched, his breathing heavy with exertion and alcohol. Victor Rollins, Betty's husband, the monster who had turned a home into a prison and a child into a survivor before he'd even learned to read. You think you can leave me? Victor was snarling, not yet aware of the stranger who had entered his kingdom. You think anyone else would want you? You're nothing without me. Nothing. Get away from her. Anthony's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, cold and commanding. Victor spun around, surprise flickering across his face before it hardened into contempt. He saw what most people saw when they looked at Anthony Ward, an expensive suit, manicured hands, the softness of wealth. He saw an easy target. Who the hell are you? The person who's going to make sure you never touch her again. Victor laughed, an ugly sound that filled the kitchen. Mind your own business, rich boy. This is between me and my wife. Not anymore. Victor's assessment took half a second. Suit meant money. Money meant weakness. Weakness meant this would be easy. He lunged forward, fist already swinging. Victor's mistake was assuming that money made men soft. What it had actually bought Anthony was 3 years of training with the best combat instructors in the world, men who had protected heads of state and survived war zones. The money had bought him the skills to channel his guilt and rage into something precise and devastating. Anthony deflected the first punch, redirecting Victor's momentum. The second punch never landed because Anthony was already inside his guard, delivering a strike to the solar plexus that emptied Victor's lungs of air. A sweep took his legs. An elbow to the temple ensured he stayed down. 30 seconds. That's all it took. 30 seconds and 18 months of abuse came to an end on a kitchen floor stained with Betty's blood. Victor groaned, trying to rise, and Anthony placed a foot on his chest. "Stay down," Anthony said, his voice eerily calm. "The police are on their way. If you move, if you even think about getting up, I will make sure you never walk again. Do you understand me?" Victor's eyes, glazed with alcohol and pain, focused on Anthony's face. Whatever he saw there made him stop struggling. Good choice. Anthony stepped back, keeping Victor in his peripheral vision while he called out into the house. "Sean? Sean, you can come out now. You're safe. The bad man can't hurt anyone anymore." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a closet door creaked open. A small face appeared in the hallway, peeking around the corner with the wariness of a child who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. Sean Hill was 5 years old. He had dark curly hair that stuck up in every direction and wide brown eyes that seemed too old for his face. He was wearing dinosaur pajamas, clutching a stuffed elephant that had clearly seen better days. Gerald, Anthony remembered. His friend who wasn't scared because Sean had told him not to be. "Are you Anthony?" Sean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, buddy. I'm Anthony. I came just like I promised." "You really came." "I really came." Sean's lower lip trembled. Then, without warning, he ran across the kitchen and threw his arms around Anthony's legs, hugging with the desperate strength of a child who had finally found something to hold on to. Anthony froze for a moment, unprepared for the contact. Then, slowly, he crouched down and wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him close. "You're safe now," Anthony murmured into Sean's hair. "Both of you, you're safe. Is Mummy okay?" Sean's voice was muffled against Anthony's shoulder. "She's hurt, but she's going to be okay. We're going to take her to the doctor, and they're going to fix her up." "Promise?" There was that word again. Promise. Such a small word to carry so much weight. "I promise," Anthony said. And this time, he meant it with his entire soul. The sirens arrived 7 minutes later, filling the quiet neighborhood with red and blue lights that drew neighbors to their windows. Paramedics rushed in to stabilize Betty while police officers hauled Victor to his feet and read him his rights. The chaos of official response replaced the chaos of violence, structured and procedural, and somehow more bearable. Anthony stood in the corner of the kitchen, Sean still clutching his hand, watching the scene unfold. A police officer approached with a notebook and a professional expression that didn't quite hide his curiosity. "Sir, can I get your statement? And your name for the record?" "Anthony Ward. I'm the founder of the Hope Foundation. We partner with emergency services to provide resources for domestic violence victims. I was monitoring dispatch calls when this situation came in, and I arrived before your units could respond." The officer's eyebrows rose. "Anthony Ward. As in Ward Industries?" "Yes." The shift in demeanor was immediate, the way it always was when people connected the name to the empire. Anthony had stopped being surprised by it years ago. Wealth opened doors and commanded respect, even when neither had been earned. "Mr. Ward," the officer said, his tone now deferential, "we appreciate your intervention. The situation could have been much worse." "The situation was already worse than it should have ever been," Anthony replied, his voice quiet but sharp. "That woman has been abused for God knows how long. That child has been traumatized. Where were the systems that should have protected them?" The officer had no answer. There never was a good answer to that question. The paramedics loaded Betty onto a stretcher, stabilizing her arm and monitoring her vitals. She was conscious now, more alert, her eyes searching frantically for her son. "Sean! Where's Sean?" "Right here, Mummy." Sean broke from Anthony's side and ran to his mother, grabbing her uninjured hand. The paramedics paused, allowing the moment. "I called the number, Mummy, just like you taught me. And then Anthony came. He came just like he promised." Betty's gaze lifted to Anthony, standing a few feet away. Her eyes were filled with confusion, pain, and something that might have been gratitude struggling to surface through layers of shock. "Who are you?" she managed. "Someone who answered the call," Anthony replied. Nothing more. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. This night had connected them in ways that would only become clear with time. For now, it was enough that they were alive, that Sean was safe, that Victor was in handcuffs, finally powerless. The ambulance would take Betty and Sean to the hospital. Anthony would give his statement and then follow in his car. There would be paperwork and questions and the grinding machinery of the justice system. But all of that was secondary to the simple, profound truth of the moment. A 5-year-old had called for help and someone had come. To understand why Anthony Ward was monitoring dispatch calls at midnight instead of sleeping in his penthouse, you need to know the story he carries with him everywhere he goes. The story of the promise he broke, and the sister he lost, and the guilt that turned a grieving brother into a billionaire vigilante searching for redemption in other people's tragedies. Anthony was born 38 years ago in a Bronx apartment with roaches in the walls and dreams on every surface. His mother, Marguerite, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and hope in her children's hearts. There were 2 of them, Anthony, the eldest, and Miranda, 2 years younger. 2 kids against the world, with nothing but each other and the unshakable belief that someday things would be different. They were close in the way that only siblings who survive poverty together can be close. They studied at the same kitchen table, sharing a single lamp because electricity was expensive. They dreamed out loud about the lives they would build, the money they would make, the day they would buy their mother a house where she could finally rest. Anthony was the protector. Even as a child, he understood that his role was to shield Miranda from the harshness of their reality. When the other kids teased her for her second-hand clothes, Anthony fought them. When she struggled with math, Anthony tutored her. When she cried because dinner was just bread and butter again, Anthony made up stories about how they were actually fancy French people eating artisanal cuisine. He was going to take care of her forever. That was the deal. That was always the deal. At 18, Anthony received the news that would change everything: a full scholarship to Columbia University, engineering, a path out of poverty, a chance to become someone who could actually provide the life he'd been promising. His mother cried with joy. Miranda hugged him so tight he couldn't breathe. But the night before he left, Miranda came to his room with something else in her eyes: fear, and bruises on her arms that she tried to hide under long sleeves. "What happened?" Anthony demanded, his protective instincts flaring. "Who did this to you?" "It's nothing. I fell." "Miranda, don't lie to me." She broke down then, telling him about Derek, the boyfriend she'd been seeing for 6 months, the charming man who had slowly revealed a darker side. The first time he'd hit her, he'd cried and promised it would never happen again. The second time, he'd blamed her for provoking him. The third time, he'd threatened worse if she told anyone. "Leave him," Anthony said immediately. "Tonight. Pack your things and come stay with Mom until I get settled at school. Then you can move in with me. We'll figure it out." Miranda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not that simple. He'll find me. He always says he'll find me if I try to leave. And besides," she added, her voice so small, "he's not always like this. When he's good, he's really good. Maybe if I just try harder, if I don't make him angry, he'll go back to being the person I fell in love with." The words made Anthony's blood run cold, but he was 18 and naive and so focused on his own future that he couldn't see the cliff his sister was standing on. "Let me get settled at school first," he said, and those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Just give me a few months. Once I'm established, I'll come back and help you. We'll figure out a way to get you free. Just hold on a little longer." "I believe you," Miranda said, and she smiled even though her eyes were still wet with tears. "You always keep your promises, Anthony. I know you'll come back for me." He hugged her then, holding her close, telling himself that a few months wasn't that long, that Derek might calm down, that maybe he was overreacting, that surely nothing too terrible could happen in the time it took him to get his footing at college. He was wrong. Columbia was everything Anthony had dreamed of, and more. The campus was beautiful, the classes were challenging, and for the first time in his life he was surrounded by people who saw his potential rather than his poverty. He threw himself into his studies with the desperation of someone who knew this was his only chance. The calls home became less frequent, weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly. When he talked to Miranda, she always said she was fine. Things were better with Derek, she claimed. He was trying harder. They were working things out. Anthony wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe her than to face the possibility that his sister was drowning while he was busy building his raft. 14 months after Anthony left for college, his phone rang at 3 a.m. He knew before he answered. Some part of him had always known. It was his mother's voice, broken in ways that couldn't be repaired. Miranda's in the hospital. She might not wake up. He beat her so badly, Anthony. Why didn't we help her? Why didn't anyone help her? The world collapsed. Anthony drove through the night to reach the hospital, ignoring speed limits and red lights and the tears that blurred his vision. He arrived at dawn to find his mother in the waiting room, looking a decade older than she had when he'd left. Miranda was in the ICU, life support, machines breathing for her because her own lungs had filled with blood. Her face was unrecognizable beneath bandages and swelling. Derek had been arrested at the scene, having called 911 himself in a moment of terrified clarity after realizing he'd gone too far. Anthony sat beside his sister's bed for 3 days. He held her hand and talked to her and begged her to wake up. He bargained with God and the universe and anyone who might be listening. He promised he would do anything, give up anything, sacrifice anything, if she would just open her eyes. On the 3rd day, her heart stopped. The machines wailed their morning song, and despite the doctor's best efforts, Miranda stayed silent forever. She died on a Tuesday morning, 4 months shy of her 20th birthday. Anthony was the one who had to tell their mother. He was the one who had to plan the funeral and stand beside the coffin and accept condolences from people who had no idea that his sister had been screaming for help while the world looked away. He was the one who had to face the terrible truth. He had promised to come back for her, and he had failed. The grief was a living thing, a creature that wrapped itself around his chest and made breathing feel impossible. But underneath the grief was something even more destructive: rage. Derek was arrested, awaiting trial. Anthony wanted to kill him. He wanted to wrap his hands around the man's throat and squeeze until the light went out of his eyes. He wanted to make him feel every blow he'd inflicted on Miranda, every moment of terror she'd endured. He nearly did it. He found out which jail Derek was being held in and actually drove there one night, sitting in the parking lot for hours, imagining ways he might get close enough to end it. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Miranda's voice in his head, telling him not to throw his life away. Maybe it was the realization that violence wouldn't bring her back. Maybe it was just cowardice. He drove home instead, and the rage turned inward. Anthony dropped out of Columbia for a semester. He nearly lost his scholarship. He spent weeks in his childhood bedroom, unable to face the world that had kept spinning while his sister was being beaten to death. But eventually, something shifted. The grief didn't lessen, but it changed shape. It became fuel. It became purpose. He returned to school with a new intensity, graduating at the top of his class. He threw himself into the business world with the single-minded focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. Within 10 years, he had built Ward Industries into a billion-dollar empire. By 34, he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, but the money meant nothing. The success was hollow. Every achievement was shadowed by the knowledge that he had failed the one person who mattered most. 3 years before the night of Sean's call, Anthony founded the Hope Foundation. On paper, it was a nonprofit that partnered with emergency services to provide resources for domestic violence victims, housing, legal aid, therapy, the practical support that could mean the difference between escape and entrapment. In reality, it was penance, an attempt to answer the calls he'd missed, to show up for strangers in hopes of someday deserving forgiveness from a sister who was no longer there to grant it. He became obsessive about the work. He attended board meetings and reviewed budgets and personally interviewed every employee. And sometimes on nights when sleep wouldn't come and the ghosts were too loud, he would go to the dispatch center and monitor calls, waiting, searching, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would find a moment that mattered, a call he could answer, a life he could save. Sean Hill's voice came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and for the first time in 4 years, Anthony felt like he might finally have a chance to keep a promise. Before we go any further, I need to pause and ask you something. Have you ever carried guilt so heavy that success felt meaningless? Have you ever tried to outrun a mistake only to realize it's been running with you the whole time? Have you ever looked at everything you've built and thought, none of this matters, because I failed the person who needed me most? Anthony Ward has everything money can buy and nothing money can't. He has an empire and a legacy and more zeros in his bank account than most people can comprehend. And yet every night, he's haunted by a phone call he didn't answer, a promise he didn't keep, a sister who died waiting for him to show up. This story isn't just about rescue. It's about redemption. It's about the question that keeps so many of us awake at night. Is it possible to make up for the past? Can we ever truly atone for the people we failed to save? If you're watching this and seeing pieces of your own story, if you've ever wished you could go back and answer a call you missed, drop a heart emoji in the comments. And if you believe that second chances are possible, not guaranteed, but possible, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to prove that redemption isn't a destination. It's a choice you make every single day. Now, let's continue our journey. We've seen who Anthony Ward is and why he answered Sean's call. But there's another person in this story who needs to be understood. A woman who learned to survive in the shadows. A mother who taught her son to call for help even when she'd stopped believing help would come. This is Betty Hill's story. Betty was born in rural Ohio, the daughter of a firefighter and a nurse. Her childhood was the kind that appears in nostalgic photographs. Summer afternoons catching fireflies, winter evenings around the Christmas tree. Parents who loved each other and loved their daughter even more. Her father, Thomas, was her hero. A man who ran into burning buildings to save strangers. A man who taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else was more important than fear. He read her bedtime stories about princesses who saved themselves and knights who asked permission before rescuing anyone. He told her she could be anything she wanted, and she believed him, because Thomas Coleman never lied. He died when she was 16, a warehouse fire that went wrong, a floor that collapsed without warning, a radio that went silent and stayed silent. Betty watched her mother grieve with a dignity that broke her heart. Margaret Coleman cried for 6 months, then slowly put herself back together. She returned to work at the hospital. She cooked dinner every night even when she wasn't hungry. She reminded Betty that the world kept spinning whether we wanted it to or not, and our job was to spin with it. "You'll survive this," Margaret told her daughter. "We survive everything. That's what the women in this family do." Betty carried those words with her to college, where she studied social work, because she wanted to help people the way her father had. She wanted to run into metaphorical burning buildings and pull people to safety. She wanted to be brave. Her first serious boyfriend showed up junior year. Handsome, attentive, everything she thought she wanted. For 3 months, he was perfect. Then the comments started. "You're wearing that? Maybe you should eat less. Why are you talking to other guys? Don't you know how that makes me look?" The first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, Betty recognized what was happening. Her mother had made sure she knew the signs, had educated her about the cycles of abuse, had given her the language to name what so many women couldn't. Betty left him that night, packed her bags, called campus security, filed a report. It was terrifying and humiliating and absolutely the right thing to do. She thought she'd learned enough to protect herself. She thought she would never be that woman, the one who stayed, the one who made excuses, the one who believed it would get better. She was wrong. Victor Rollins walked into her life at a friend's birthday party when Betty was 26. He was charming in a way that felt earned rather than performed. He remembered details she'd mentioned in passing. He sent flowers not on predictable occasions but on random Tuesdays just because. He met her mother and impressed her with his manners and his questions about Thomas, treating the dead hero with a respect that made Margaret tear up. He was the opposite of her college boyfriend. Where that man had been possessive from the start, Victor was secure. Where that man had criticized, Victor complimented. Where that man had tried to control her, Victor encouraged her independence. At least, that's what Betty thought. That's what she needed to believe. They moved in together after 8 months. The first warning signs were small enough to explain away. Victor's jealousy when she mentioned male coworkers. "He just loves me so much." His temper when waiters made mistakes. He's having a stressful week. His dislike of her closest friends. He wants us to spend more time together. The first time he raised his voice at her, really raised it, screaming inches from her face about something trivial, Betty's heart stopped. But then he apologized so sincerely, so completely, that she convinced herself it was an aberration. Everyone has bad days. Everyone makes mistakes. The first time he shoved her, she was 7 months pregnant. She'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. A small thing, nothing, the kind of mistake anyone might make. But Victor had been building toward explosion all week, and this was the spark that ignited the fire. He grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her against the wall. His face, the face she'd thought she loved, was twisted into something unrecognizable. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to hit her stomach, going to hurt the baby, going to destroy the only good thing they'd created together. Instead, he let go, stepped back, and then, as always, the tears came, the apologies, the promises that it would never happen again, the flowers and the tenderness and the man she'd fallen for reappearing as if the monster had never existed. Betty wanted to leave. In that moment, trembling against the wall with her hands protective over her belly, she wanted nothing more than to run. But where would she go? She'd quit her job at Victor's insistence to focus on the pregnancy. Her mother was 3 hours away and didn't know the truth. Her friends had slowly drifted as Victor isolated her from everyone who might help her see clearly. And besides, she told herself, maybe this was just the stress of the baby coming. Maybe once Sean was born, Victor would calm down. Maybe she could fix this if she just tried harder, loved better, gave him fewer reasons to be angry. She didn't leave. Sean was born on a March morning, and for a brief, shimmering moment, everything seemed perfect. Victor cried when he held his son for the first time. He was gentle with Betty during her recovery. He brought flowers to the hospital and told everyone who would listen that he was the luckiest man alive. The honeymoon phase lasted 3 months. Then the cycle resumed, worse than before. The tension building, the explosion, the honeymoon, the tension building again. Betty learned to read Victor's moods the way a sailor learns to read the sky, looking for signs of coming storms. She learned which topics were safe and which would trigger rage. She learned to keep Sean quiet, to keep the house clean, to anticipate Victor's needs before he even expressed them. She became an expert in survival. But survival wasn't living. Survival was just not dying, one day at a time. The years blurred together. Sean grew from an infant to a toddler to a little boy who understood too much and said too little. Betty watched her son learn the rules that no child should have to learn. When daddy's voice gets loud, hide. When mommy says go to your room, go quickly and quietly. When the bad things happen, cover your ears and count to 100. She taught him to call 911 because some small part of her, the part that still remembered being brave, knew that someday he might need to. She made him practice, made him memorize the address, told him that if anything ever happened to her, he should call the number and help would come. But secretly, in the dark corners of her heart, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Help had never come for her. The neighbors who must have heard the screaming never knocked on the door. The doctor who treated her suspicious bruises never asked the right questions. The world that was supposed to protect people like her seemed perfectly content to look the other way. 5 years passed. 5 years of walking on eggshells and hiding bruises and teaching her son to survive. 5 years of telling herself that tomorrow she would leave, that next month she would find the courage that someday things would be different. And then, one night, Victor found the apartment listings on her computer. She'd been looking in secret, late at night when he was passed out from drinking. Small apartments in neighborhoods far from Cedar Lane. Places where she could start over. Places where Sean could learn that not all men were monsters. Victor found the browser history, and the rage that followed was unlike anything Betty had experienced before. He was going to kill her. She knew it with a certainty that transcended fear. Tonight was the night that her story ended, not with escape, but with the funeral that her mother would have to plan. She did the only thing she could think of. She led him away from Sean's room. If she was going to die, at least her son wouldn't have to watch. The kitchen became a battleground. Victor's fists, the counter's edge, the shattering of everything she'd tried to hold together. Her arm broke when she fell, but she barely felt it. Pain was abstract when survival was immediate. Somewhere in the chaos, she screamed for Sean to hide. She prayed he remembered the phone number. She hoped, with the last shred of hope she possessed, that this time someone would actually come. And then, impossibly, someone did. When Betty opened her eyes in the hospital 3 hours later, the first thing she saw was her son's face. Sean was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, his eyes red from crying but his expression determined. "I called the number, Mummy, just like you taught me." And then Anthony came. He came just like he promised. Betty turned her head, which hurt more than she expected, and saw a stranger standing in the doorway. Expensive suit, now rumpled and stained. Dark eyes that held more pain than she knew how to interpret. A face that was unfamiliar and yet somehow felt safe. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse and damage. "My name is Anthony Ward. I run a foundation that helps people in situations like yours. Your son called 911, and I happened to be in a position to respond. Betty's mind struggled to process this information. A foundation, a billionaire, a man who showed up at midnight to save strangers. It didn't make sense. People didn't do that. People looked away, kept their distance, protected themselves from other people's problems. Why? She managed. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, and Betty saw something shift in his expression. Something raw and wounded that he quickly tried to hide. "Because someone should have helped my sister," he said finally. "And no one did." The words hung between them, creating a bridge that neither of them fully understood yet. Two people carved by loss. Two stories of failure and survival. Two chances to do better than the past. Betty didn't trust him. She couldn't. Trust was a luxury she'd lost the ability to afford. But she looked at her son, at his face that had finally relaxed from the permanent tension he'd carried for as long as she could remember, and she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Whatever this man's motives, whatever strings might be attached, he'd shown up when no one else would. He'd kept a promise to a child he'd never met. He'd walked into a stranger's nightmare and fought the monster. For now, that would have to be enough. "Okay," Betty said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, tell me what happens next." And for the first time in 5 years, she was ready to believe that what happened next might actually be something good. What happens next is never as simple as the rescue. The rescue is the dramatic moment, the climax that makes for good stories. But the aftermath is where the real work begins. The slow, grinding, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from the rubble of trauma. Betty spent 3 days in the hospital. Her arm was set in a cast that would need to remain for 6 weeks. Her ribs were taped, each breath a reminder of what she'd survived. The concussion required monitoring, but the doctors were optimistic. Physically, she would heal. The other wounds, the ones that didn't show up on x-rays, would take considerably longer. Sean refused to leave her side. He slept in the chair beside her bed, curled up with Gerald the elephant, waking at every sound with the hypervigilance of a child who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. The nurses brought him extra pillows and snacks, charmed by his seriousness and heartbroken by the circumstances that had created it. Anthony visited twice. The first time was the night of the rescue, when everything was chaos and confusion. The second time was the following afternoon, when the shock had worn off enough for Betty to actually process what was happening. He arrived with coffee for her and a coloring book for Sean, small gestures that seemed designed to be helpful without being overwhelming. He sat in the visitor's chair and explained, in calm and measured tones, what resources were available through the Hope Foundation. "We have transitional housing," he said. "Safe, secure, with 24-hour security. You and Sean can stay there while you get back on your feet. There's no time limit. Some families stay for a few months, some for a year or more. Whatever you need." Betty listened with the skepticism that had kept her alive through 5 years of abuse. Nothing was free. Nothing came without strings. Every gift Victor had ever given her had been a chain in disguise. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No catch. There's always a catch." Anthony was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider her words carefully. "You're right that most things in life come with conditions. But this doesn't. The foundation exists specifically to help people in your situation. We're funded by grants and private donations, including a substantial portion of my personal wealth. You don't owe me anything. You don't owe the foundation anything. The only expectation is that you use the resources to build a safer life for yourself and your son." "Why do you care so much?" Betty pressed. "You don't know me. You don't know Sean. We're strangers. Why would you spend your money and your time on strangers?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Anthony's expression flickered, and for a moment, Betty saw something beneath the polished exterior. Pain, old and deep and carefully hidden. "I told you about my sister," he said finally. "Miranda. She died 4 years ago because I wasn't there when she needed me. I was too busy building my career, too focused on my own future. I told her to wait, to hold on, that I would help her eventually. Eventually came too late." Betty felt something shift in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of one broken person looking at another. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "So am I, every day for the rest of my life. But sorry doesn't bring her back. Nothing does. What I can do is make sure other families have a chance she didn't get. That's why I care. That's why I show up at midnight when children call for help. It won't bring Miranda back, but it means something to me that someone answers the calls now." Sean looked up from his coloring book, having listened to the entire conversation with the attentiveness children develop when they learn that adult words often determine their fate. "Your sister was hurt by a bad man too?" he asked. "Yes," Anthony replied, his voice gentle. "She was. Is that why you saved us? Because you couldn't save her?" The directness of the question made Betty wince, but Anthony didn't flinch. He met Sean's gaze with complete honesty. "Yes, buddy, that's exactly why." Sean nodded slowly, processing this information with the gravity of a much older child. Then he returned to his coloring book, apparently satisfied with the answer. "Okay," Betty said, the word feeling like a surrender. "Tell me about this transitional housing." The apartment was nicer than anywhere Betty had lived since leaving her mother's house. Clean, bright, furnished with simple but comfortable pieces. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with windows that looked out over a courtyard. Security cameras in the hallways, guards at the entrance who checked identification before allowing anyone through. It felt like a fortress. It felt like safety. It felt almost too good to be true. Elena, the caseworker assigned to their family, walked them through the resources available. Therapy for Betty, specialized in trauma and domestic violence. Play therapy for Sean to help him process the things he'd witnessed. Legal advocacy for the criminal case against Victor and the divorce that Betty would need to file. Job training when she was ready. Connections to employers who specifically hired survivors. "I know this is overwhelming," Elena said, her voice warm and understanding. "You don't have to figure everything out right now. The first step is just being safe. Everything else can wait until you're ready." Betty nodded, not trusting her voice. She was sitting on the couch in their new living room while Sean explored his bedroom with something approaching wonder. She could hear him talking to Gerald, explaining that this was their new home, that it was safe, that the bad man couldn't find them here. "Is that true?" Betty asked Elena. "Is it really safe? Victor is going to get out eventually. He's going to come looking for us. The criminal case is strong," Elena replied. "He's facing serious charges. Assault causing bodily harm, domestic violence, violating the duty of care to a minor. The prosecutor is pushing for maximum sentencing. He's likely to serve several years. Several years isn't forever. No, it's not. But several years is time to rebuild. Time to get strong again. Time to create a life that he can't touch. And when he does get out, there will be restraining orders in place. There will be security protocols. You won't be as vulnerable as you were before." Betty wanted to believe her. She wanted to trust that the systems that had failed her for so long would somehow protect her now. But trust was a muscle that had atrophied from disuse, and rebuilding it would take time. "Can I ask you something?" Betty said. "Of course." Anthony Ward, the man who came that night. Does he do this often? Show up personally for rescues? Elena smiled slightly. "He's not supposed to. He has staff for that. But yes, he monitors calls sometimes, especially late at night. The other staff members have learned not to question it. He founded this organization after his sister's death, and I think he's still looking for her in every call that comes through. He seems like a good man." "He is, though I suspect he'd disagree with that assessment. People who carry guilt rarely see their own virtue." Betty turned this observation over in her mind, examining it from different angles. A good man who didn't believe he was good. A billionaire who spent his nights listening to emergency calls. A stranger who had walked into her nightmare and fought her monster. She didn't know what to do with any of it. So she filed it away and focused on the immediate, learning the layout of her new home, establishing routines for Sean, beginning the long process of rebuilding a life that had been systematically destroyed. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment. Sean started at a new school nearby, enrolled under the Foundation's protection with his location shielded from Victor's potential discovery. Betty began therapy sessions that left her emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. The legal case proceeded through its grinding machinery, with Victor denied bail and awaiting trial. Anthony didn't visit. Betty told herself she wasn't disappointed. She had no right to be disappointed. He'd done more than enough by saving their lives and providing resources. He was a busy man, a billionaire with an empire to run. His absence was completely reasonable and expected, but Sean asked about him every day. "When is Anthony coming back?" "I don't know, baby. He's very busy, but he promised he'd help. He said he'd come back. He did help, sweetheart. He got us to safety. He gave us this apartment. That's more than most people would do." but I want to see him again. Betty didn't know how to explain that the world didn't work the way children thought it should. That promises from adults often went unkept. That hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. "We'll see," she said, because that was what parents said when they didn't have better answers. At the Hope Foundation headquarters, Anthony was fighting a battle he'd never anticipated, the urge to get involved. He'd done his job. He'd answered the call, neutralized the threat, connected the family with resources. That was the extent of his role. He was a donor and a founder, not a social worker. His involvement was supposed to be systemic, not personal. But he couldn't stop thinking about them. Sean's voice on the phone, brave and terrified in equal measure. Betty's eyes in the hospital, wary and wounded, and somehow still fighting. The way Sean had run to him and hugged his legs like Anthony was something worth holding on to. "You're distracted," his assistant noted during a meeting he was only half paying attention to. "Should I reschedule the afternoon calls?" "No, I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He was anything but fine. For 4 years, he'd maintained careful boundaries around his foundation work. He funded, he oversaw, he occasionally intervened, but he never got attached. Attachment meant caring, and caring meant potential loss, and he'd already lost more than he knew how to survive. But Sean kept asking about him. Elena had mentioned it during her weekly report, trying to keep her tone professional, even as her eyes conveyed something more pointed. "The boy asks about you every day. He calls you the man who keeps promises." "I don't keep promises," Anthony wanted to say. "Ask my sister." But Miranda was beyond asking, and Sean was very much alive, and the boy's faith was simultaneously the most precious and the most terrifying thing Anthony had ever encountered. A week after the rescue, his phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Sean drew you a picture. He wants to give it to you personally. I told him I'd ask." Anthony stared at the message for a long time. His thumbs hovered over the screen, ready to type a polite refusal. He had meetings. He had responsibilities. He had walls that had taken years to build and only seconds to start crumbling. He typed back, "I'll be there Saturday afternoon if that works." The reply came almost instantly. "He'll be thrilled. So will his mother, though she'd never admit it." Anthony put down his phone and wondered what the hell he was doing. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray November weather that made staying indoors feel justified. Anthony drove to the transitional housing facility with a gift in his passenger seat, a book about famous buildings throughout history, chosen because Elena had mentioned that Sean seemed interested in how things were put together. He was nervous. Billionaires weren't supposed to get nervous about visiting 5-year-olds. But his hands were slightly unsteady as he pressed the buzzer for Betty's apartment, and his heart rate increased when her voice came through the speaker. "Hello? It's Anthony. Anthony Ward. Elena said Sean wanted to give me something." A pause. Then, "Come on up." The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. The hallway felt endless. By the time he reached their door, Anthony had convinced himself this was a mistake at least 3 times. But then the door opened, and Sean's face appeared, and the boy's expression lit up with the kind of pure joy that adults forget is possible. "You came back." "I told you I would," Anthony said, and the words felt both true and terrifying. Sean grabbed his hand and pulled him inside, chattering about the picture he'd drawn and the new school he was attending, and the fact that Gerald the elephant had decided he liked the new apartment because it was quiet and nobody yelled. Betty stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. She looked better than she had in the hospital, though the bruises were still visible beneath makeup that couldn't quite hide them. Her arm was still in a cast. Her eyes were still wary. But there was something else there too. Something that might, with enough time, become welcome. "He's been talking about you all week," she said. "I was starting to think you were imaginary. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I wasn't sure if you'd want me here. Sean wanted you here. That's enough." Anthony nodded, accepting the boundary she was establishing. He was here for Sean, not for her. His presence was about a child's request, not about whatever complicated feelings were stirring in the spaces between them. "Come see my picture," Sean insisted, pulling Anthony toward the small kitchen table where art supplies were scattered. The picture was surprisingly detailed for a 5-year-old. It showed 3 figures, a small one with curly hair, a taller one with long hair, and a third one standing slightly apart, drawn larger than the others, with a cape flowing behind him. "That's me and Mummy," Sean explained, pointing to the first 2 figures. "And that's you. You're wearing a cape because you're a hero." "I'm not a hero," Anthony said automatically. "Yes, you are. Heroes are people who help when other people are scared. That's what you did. So, you're a hero. The logic was unassailable. Anthony felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built to protect himself from exactly this kind of moment. Thank you, Sean. This is the best picture anyone's ever given me. Really, really. I'm going to put it in my office so I can look at it every day. Sean beamed with a pride that seemed too big for his small body to contain. Then he noticed the book in Anthony's hands. What's that? I brought you something. It's a book about famous buildings from all over the world. I thought you might like it since you mentioned you were interested in how things are put together. Sean's eyes went wide. He took the book like it was a treasure, turning pages with careful reverence, gasping at photographs of skyscrapers and castles and bridges. Mummy, look. It has the Empire State Building, and the Eiffel Tower, and a building made entirely of glass. Betty moved closer, looking over her son's shoulder at the images. Her expression softened in a way that made Anthony's breath catch. That's very thoughtful, she said quietly. Thank you. It's nothing. Just something small. It's not nothing. She met his eyes. Nothing is ever small when you're starting from scratch. The afternoon passed faster than Anthony expected. He sat at the kitchen table while Sean showed him every page of the book, providing commentary that mixed childish enthusiasm with surprisingly astute observations. Betty made coffee and sat across from them, listening, occasionally interjecting, slowly relaxing into something that almost resembled comfort. By the time the light outside had turned from gray to darker gray, Sean had moved on to showing Anthony his bedroom and explaining the elaborate backstory he'd created for Gerald the elephant. Apparently, Gerald was a secret agent who protected children from monsters, and his cover as a stuffed toy allowed him to gather intelligence without being detected. That's very clever, Anthony said, sitting on the edge of Sean's bed while the boy demonstrated Gerald's various spy moves. Did you come up with that yourself? Mummy helped. She's good at stories. She used to read me stories about dragons and princes, but the prince was never the one who did the saving. The princess always saved herself. That sounds like a good message. Mummy says we shouldn't wait for other people to save us. We should learn to save ourselves. But sometimes, she said, sometimes it's okay to let other people help, because even heroes need backup. Your mummy is a very smart woman. I know. Sean lowered his voice conspiratorially. She's also really pretty, but she doesn't think so because the bad man said mean things about her. You should tell her she's pretty. Maybe she'd believe it if someone else said it. Anthony was caught off guard by the suggestion, unsure how to respond. Before he could formulate an answer, Betty appeared in the doorway. Sean, it's almost dinner time. Say goodbye to Anthony. Do you have to go? Sean's face fell. I should probably head home. But I can come back again, if that's okay. Sean looked to his mother for confirmation. Betty hesitated for just a moment before nodding. We'd like that, she said, and Anthony could tell the words cost her something. Trust didn't come easy to someone who'd had it shattered so completely. But she was trying for Sean's sake, and Anthony respected that more than he could express. At the door, after Sean had hugged him goodbye and returned to his room to plan more spy missions with Gerald, Anthony paused. Thank you, he said to Betty, for letting me come. You kept your promise to him. That matters more than you know. He's had so few adults keep their promises. I intend to keep doing it. Coming, I mean. If you're comfortable with that. Betty's expression was complicated. Layers of caution and hope and things she wasn't ready to name. We'll see how it goes, she said. One day at a time. One day at a time, Anthony agreed. It was the only pace either of them could handle. The visits became a routine. Every Saturday afternoon, Anthony arrived with coffee for Betty and some small gift for Sean. Nothing extravagant, just books or art supplies or the occasional toy that fit the boys' growing interests. They would spend hours together, talking and drawing and reading, establishing rhythms that felt dangerously close to normal. But it wasn't just Saturdays. Anthony started calling during the week, short conversations ostensibly to check on their progress, but really just to hear Sean's voice recounting his school day. Video chats where Sean would show him his latest drawings or demonstrate something new he'd learned. Small connections that wove themselves into the fabric of his daily life. You're spending a lot of time with them, Elena observed during one of their foundation meetings. More than you've ever spent with a family before. Is that a problem? Not at all. It's just interesting. You've always been careful to maintain boundaries, professional distance. But with this family, you seem different. Anthony didn't have a good answer for that. He was different with them. He couldn't explain why without exposing vulnerabilities he'd spent years protecting. Sean needs consistency, he said finally. He needs to know that people can be trusted. I'm providing that. And Betty? What does she need? The question was pointed, and Anthony knew Elena was seeing more than he wanted her to see. Betty needs time to heal, he said carefully. She needs support and resources and the space to rebuild her life on her own terms. That's what the foundation provides. Elena nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Just be careful, she said. Healing is complicated, and feelings that develop during crisis don't always survive the transition to normal life. There are no feelings, Anthony insisted. I'm just helping. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. 3 months after the rescue, the routine shifted. What had been weekly visits became twice weekly, then more frequent still. Anthony found himself rearranging his schedule to accommodate dinner at their apartment, staying late to help Sean with a building project, finding excuses to be present that had nothing to do with the foundation's mission. Betty noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything, having spent years learning to read people for signs of danger. But instead of pulling away, she seemed to be cautiously opening up. You don't have to keep coming, she said one evening after Sean had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie. You've done more than enough. We're stable now. We don't need constant supervision. I know you don't need it, Anthony replied carefully. But I want to come. If that's still okay. Why? The question was the same one she'd asked in the hospital, but it felt different now. Heavier. More personal. Because you and Sean make me feel like I'm actually doing something good, Anthony admitted. Not just throwing money at problems. Actually helping. Being present. It's been a long time since I felt like that. Betty was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sleeping form of her son. He calls you Dad sometimes, she said finally. When he's talking to his friends at school. Did you know that? Anthony's heart stuttered. No, I didn't know that. His friend Jacob asked where his dad was, and Sean said his dad was a hero who saves people. I'm not sure if I should correct him. Do you want to correct him? I don't know. Betty's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know what to want anymore. For so long, survival was enough. Get through the day. Protect Sean. Don't make Victor angry. I didn't have room for wanting anything beyond that. And now I'm safe. Sean's happy. And I don't know what to do with all the space that's opened up. What would you want if you let yourself want it? The question hung between them, charged with implications neither of them was ready to examine directly. Betty finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dim light from the television screen. I would want to believe that good things can last, she said. That not every man who shows kindness is hiding something ugly underneath. That my son can have a father figure who doesn't teach him that love comes with fists. I would want to stop being afraid all the time. Those are things worth wanting. Are they possible, though? After everything? Anthony thought about Miranda, about the 4 years he'd spent running from his guilt, about the walls he'd built and the life he'd lived on the other side of them, alone and successful and completely hollow. I don't know if they're guaranteed, he said honestly, but I think they're possible. For both of us. Both of us. I've been running from my own pain for a long time, Betty, trying to outwork it, outbuild it, outfund it. But sitting here with you and Sean, eating dinner and watching movies and doing the ordinary things I've been avoiding for years, I feel something I haven't felt since before Miranda died. I feel like maybe I'm allowed to have a life, not just a mission. The confession hung in the air between them. Betty didn't respond immediately, and Anthony wondered if he'd said too much, pushed too hard, misread the situation entirely. Then she reached out and took his hand. Just briefly, just enough to establish connection. One day at a time, she said. One day at a time, he agreed. Now, before we continue, I need to pause and speak directly to you. We're in the beautiful part of the story now, the part where healing happens and connections form and everything seems possible. But you know what comes next in stories like this. The moment when everything you've built gets tested. The moment when you find out if the foundation is solid or if it crumbles under pressure. Have you ever been in that place? Where things are finally good and you're waiting for the other shoe to drop? Where you're terrified to be happy because you know pain might be coming? If this story is speaking to you, if you're rooting for Betty and Anthony and Sean, I need you to hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson's Stories because what happens next is going to test everything this family has built. And drop a comment telling me what you think should happen. Do you believe Betty should risk her heart again? Do you think Anthony has truly changed from the man who couldn't save his sister? Your voice matters in this community we're building together. Now, let's continue, because Victor Rollins is about to be released from prison, and he hasn't forgotten what was taken from him. The call came on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the rescue. Betty was at work, having started a job as a victim advocate at the very organization that had helped save her. The poetic justice of it wasn't lost on her, using her pain to help others navigate the same systems she'd been helped through. Her phone rang, and the caller ID showed the district attorney's office. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. Ms. Hill? This is Assistant District Attorney Reeves. I'm calling to inform you about a development in the case against Victor Rollins. Betty stepped out of her office, seeking privacy for whatever was coming. What kind of development? There was a pause that felt like a lifetime. Due to prison overcrowding and his behavior during incarceration, Mr. Rollins has been granted early release. He'll be out by the end of the month. The world tilted. Betty grabbed the wall for support. Early release? He was supposed to serve at least 3 years. It's been 6 months. I understand this is difficult to hear. The system isn't perfect, and sometimes decisions are made that don't align with what survivors need. However, I want to assure you that we're taking steps to ensure your safety. A restraining order is already in place. He'll be required to wear an ankle monitor. Any violation will result in immediate rearrest. The words washed over Betty, meaningless sounds that couldn't penetrate the terror flooding her system. Restraining orders were paper. Ankle monitors could be removed. Victor had promised, during one of their many nightmare nights together, that if she ever tried to leave him, he would find her. He would always find her. Ms. Hill? Are you still there? Yes, I'm here. Thank you for informing me. She hung up and stood in the hallway, shaking. The walls that had been rebuilding, the trust that had been slowly returning, all of it collapsed in an instant. She was right back in that kitchen on the floor, waiting for the next blow. Mummy? She spun around. Sean was standing behind her, having come looking for her during his after-school visit to her workplace. His face was worried, reading her mood with the expertise of a child who'd spent his early years doing exactly that. Hey, baby. Betty forced her voice to steady. What are you doing out of Ms. Patricia's office? You looked upset. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. Just got some news that surprised me. Bad news? Betty hesitated. She'd promised herself she would never lie to her son, not the way she'd been lied to, not the way Victor had gaslit her into doubting her own reality. But how do you tell a 5-year-old now 6 that the monster from his nightmares was coming back? Maybe, she admitted, but we're going to handle it together, okay? Just like we always do. Is it about the bad man? Sean's perception never failed to stun her. Yes, she said. It's about the bad man. He's going to be getting out of the place they were keeping him. Is he coming here? No, baby. He's not allowed to come near us. There are rules that say he has to stay away. But what if he breaks the rules? The question cut to the heart of Betty's fear. Victor had never cared about rules. Victor cared about possession and control, and making sure the world knew that what was his stayed his. Then we'll deal with it, Betty said, though the words felt hollow. We have people who will help us. We have Anthony and Elena and all the people at the foundation. We're not alone anymore. Sean considered this for a moment. Can we call Anthony? He always knows what to do. Yes, baby. We can call Anthony. She made the call from her office, door closed, Sean playing quietly in the corner. Anthony answered on the second ring. Betty? Is everything okay? No, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Victor's being released. End of the month. Early release for good behavior. The silence on the other end was thunderous. Then, in a voice that had gone cold and hard and utterly controlled, he's not getting anywhere near you. Either of you. Restraining orders don't stop men like him, Anthony. You know that. I know that. He's going to come for us. He promised he would, and Victor always keeps his promises. Then we'll be ready. I'm coming over. Right now. Don't leave work until I get there. Anthony, you don't have to. I'm coming, he repeated. This is exactly what the foundation exists for. This is exactly what I exist for. I failed my sister because I didn't show up when it mattered. I'm not failing you. The line went dead, and Betty sat in her chair, trembling, waiting, caught between terror and the fragile hope that this time she really wasn't alone. Anthony arrived at her office 45 minutes later, having broken numerous traffic laws to get there. He walked in with the focused intensity of a man preparing for battle, but his expression softened when he saw Sean curled up in a chair, drawing pictures of buildings. "Hey, buddy." "Anthony." Sean jumped up and ran to him. "Mummy said the bad man is getting out of the place they were keeping him." "I know, but I don't want you to worry about that. I'm going to make sure you and your mummy stay safe." "How?" Anthony crouched down to Sean's level. "Do you remember when we talked about how I help people? How that's my job? You run the foundation. You save people from bad guys." "Exactly. And now I'm going to use everything I have to make sure the bad guy can't hurt you. We're going to get extra security. We're going to make a plan. And I'm going to be around a lot more, keeping an eye on things. Does that sound okay?" Sean nodded solemnly. "You should stay at our apartment. Then you can protect us at night too." Anthony glanced at Betty, caught off guard by the suggestion. "Sean, buddy, that's not really how it works." "Why not? You're already there all the time anyway. Mummy's happier when you're there. I'm happier. And if the bad man comes, you can fight him again like you did before." The logic was unassailable in the way that only children's logic can be. Anthony looked at Betty, whose expression was a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been longing. "We'll figure out the logistics," Anthony said carefully. "For now, let's focus on making sure your apartment is safe and that everyone knows the plan." The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Anthony deployed his resources like a general preparing for siege. Security cameras installed in the hallways around Betty's apartment. A personal security detail assigned to monitor their building. Legal team working on strengthening the restraining order and establishing protocols for violation. But the anxiety remained. Betty had nightmares again, waking up gasping, certain that Victor was in the room. Sean regressed slightly, becoming clingy, reluctant to let Betty out of his sight. The progress of the past 6 months seemed to be unraveling with terrifying speed. Anthony spent more and more time at their apartment, staying for dinner, staying later, sometimes sleeping on the couch when it became clear that his presence was the only thing keeping Betty calm enough to rest. "You should go home," she told him one night, finding him still awake at 2 a.m, sitting by the window watching the street below. "You have a life, a company to run. The company can function without me. This is more important. We can't keep you hostage to our problems, Anthony. That's not fair to you." He turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the streetlight filtering through the curtains. "You're not keeping me hostage. I'm choosing to be here. Why? Why would you choose this? The fear, the waiting, the constant looking over our shoulders. This isn't a life, Anthony. This is a prison, just a different kind. Because somewhere along the way," he said quietly, "you and Sean stopped being a mission and started being the only thing that makes sense. I spent 4 years building an empire to distract myself from my guilt, but sitting here, watching over your family, I feel more purposeful than I've ever felt in a boardroom." Betty sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just of Victor. I'm scared of needing you, of depending on you, of what happens if this doesn't work out." "Me too. Then why are we doing this?" "Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is going back to being alone. And I've been alone long enough. Haven't you?" Betty didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself feel, for just a moment, what it might be like to stop fighting, to stop protecting herself from hope, to let someone else carry part of the weight. They sat like that until dawn, watching the street, waiting for a monster who might or might not come, finding comfort in each other's presence. The end of the month arrived with a notification from the monitoring service. Victor Rollins had been released from prison. He was wearing an ankle monitor. He was required to stay at least 500 feet from Betty and Sean at all times. He was, theoretically, no longer a threat. But Betty knew better. Victor had always been patient when it served his purposes. He would wait, watch, plan. He would find a way to get to them. It was only a matter of when. The first 3 weeks after his release, nothing happened. The security detail reported no sightings. The ankle monitor showed Victor staying in his mandated zone. The restraining order remained unviolated. It was almost worse than open confrontation, the waiting, the not knowing. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, everything exploded. They were at the park, a family outing that had become part of their routine. Sean was on the swings while Betty and Anthony sat on a nearby bench, close enough to watch, far enough to give him independence. The security detail was positioned at the park entrances, visible but unobtrusive. It should have been safe. They'd taken every precaution, but Victor had been watching, planning, learning their patterns, the gaps in the security, the moments when attention might waver. He appeared from an angle the security hadn't anticipated, approaching from behind a maintenance building, moving fast. By the time Betty saw him, he was already too close. "Hello, Betty. Miss me?" The voice was the same. The smile was the same. The cold rage behind his eyes was the same. Betty's blood turned to ice. Anthony was on his feet immediately, positioning himself between Victor and Betty. The security detail was moving, but Victor had a knife, and he was holding it in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. "One more step and I'll use it," Victor said, his voice calm despite the madness in his eyes. "We're just going to have a conversation. Family business. None of this concerns the hired help." "Put the knife down," Anthony said, his voice equally calm. "Whatever you think is going to happen here, it isn't. What's going to happen is I'm taking my wife and my son back where they belong, with me, where I can take care of them properly." Victor's eyes found Sean, who had stopped swinging and was frozen on the playground, watching the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. "Hey, buddy. Daddy's back. Did you miss me?" Sean didn't answer. He didn't move. He'd been in this situation before, facing his father's rage, and every survival instinct he'd developed was screaming at him to be invisible. Betty found her voice. "Sean, baby, go to the guards. Run, now. Don't you dare move." Victor snarled, and Sean flinched but stayed frozen. "Leave him alone," Betty said, stepping forward despite Anthony's protective stance. "If you want to hurt someone, hurt me. But leave our son out of this." "Hurt you?" Victor laughed, a sound without humor. "I don't want to hurt you, Betty. I want to bring you home. Everything I did because I love you, because you're mine. You and Sean both. And no restraining order, no billionaire boyfriend, no amount of security is going to change that." "You're delusional," Anthony said. "You're going back to prison for this. Right now, maybe." Victor shrugged. "But I'll have made my point. Everyone will know that you can't take what belongs to me. That's worth a few more years behind bars." He lunged. What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt like hours. Anthony deflected the knife thrust, using techniques he'd practiced 1,000 times but never expected to need. Victor was strong and crazy and determined. But Anthony was trained and prepared and fighting for something more important than himself. They grappled, the knife between them. Betty screamed. Security finally reached them. Sean broke from his frozen state and ran, not away, but toward the fight. "Leave my dad alone." The word hung in the air. Dad, not Anthony. Dad. Victor's concentration broke for just a moment, thrown by the revelation that his son had replaced him, that his family had not only survived without him, but had found someone else, that everything he'd tried to possess had been given freely to a stranger. That moment was enough. Anthony twisted the knife away, sent it clattering across the pavement. Security tackled Victor, pinning him to the ground, handcuffing him while he screamed threats and obscenities. It was over, finally, truly over. Betty grabbed Sean, holding him close, tears streaming down her face. Anthony stood apart, breathing hard, a cut on his arm bleeding sluggishly, watching the man who'd tried to destroy them being hauled away in handcuffs. "This isn't over," Victor screamed. "You're mine. You'll always be mine." But he was wrong. He'd been wrong about everything. Betty didn't belong to anyone except herself, and she had chosen of her own free will to build something new with someone who had never once raised a hand to her. "Are you okay?" Anthony asked, moving toward them. Betty looked at the blood on his arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. A scratch. You got hurt protecting us. Again. I'd do it 1,000 times." Anthony pulled them both into a hug, the three of them standing in the middle of the park while sirens approached in the distance. "I'd do anything for you both. Don't you know that by now?" Sean looked up at him with eyes that held none of the fear they'd carried for the first 5 years of his life. "You came," he said simply. "Just like you promised." "I'll always come," Anthony replied. "Always. I promise." And for the first time, Betty let herself believe it. The police arrived. Statements were taken. Victor was hauled away, this time on charges that would ensure he stayed incarcerated for years. Real years. No early release for assaulting someone with a deadly weapon while under a restraining order. The three of them sat in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic bandaged Anthony's arm. Sean had fallen asleep against Betty's shoulder, exhausted by the adrenaline crash. Betty was staring at nothing, processing everything. "Ask me again," she said suddenly. Anthony looked at her. "What?" "Before Victor was released, you said something about feelings developing during crisis. You said you weren't sure if they could survive the transition to normal life." She turned to meet his eyes. "I think we're past crisis now. Ask me again what I want." "What do you want, Betty?" "I want you. Not because you saved us, though you did. Not because Sean adores you, though he does. I want you because in the middle of all this chaos, you became my peace. And I'm tired of being afraid to admit that." Anthony was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "Both of you. I think I have for a while. I love you too." The words were simple. The moment was simple. After everything they'd been through, it seemed only fitting that the turning point would be quiet rather than dramatic. Just two broken people choosing each other in the back of an ambulance while their son slept between them. It wasn't the ending of anything. It was the beginning of everything. The days following Victor's arrest moved with a strange combination of urgency and stillness. Legal proceedings demanded attention. Police reports required signatures, and the machinery of justice ground forward with methodical precision. But underneath all that activity, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop running from the monster and discover you've become strong enough to face it. Victor was denied bail immediately. The combination of violating a restraining order, assault with a deadly weapon, and threatening behavior in front of a minor guaranteed he would remain behind bars until trial. And this time, there would be no plea deals. The prosecutor, a woman named Diane Torres who had built her career on putting abusers away, was determined to pursue maximum sentencing. "You'll need to testify," she told Betty during their first meeting. "Both of you. I know that's difficult, but the jury needs to see who they're protecting. They need to understand what he did to your family." Betty sat in the prosecutor's office, Anthony beside her, their hands intertwined on the armrest between their chairs. 3 months ago, the idea of facing Victor in court would have paralyzed her. Now, it felt like the final step in a journey she'd been walking for years. "I'll testify," Betty said. "I want to." "Are you sure?" Prosecutor Torres asked. "These trials can be brutal. Defense attorneys will try to discredit you, paint you as unreliable, suggest that you provoked the violence or exaggerated its severity. I've spent 5 years being told that I was the problem, that I made him angry, that if I were a better wife none of this would happen." Betty's voice was steady. "I'm not going to let his lawyer say those things without pushing back. Someone needs to stand up and tell the truth. If that helps protect other women from men like him, then it's worth whatever they throw at me." Anthony squeezed her hand. "I'll testify too, about the night of the rescue and the attack at the park. Whatever you need." Prosecutor Torres nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "Good. That's good. We have a strong case. Medical records, police reports, the 911 call from your son." She paused. "Speaking of which, we may need Sean to provide a statement as well. Not in the courtroom. We don't put children through that. But a recorded interview that can be submitted as evidence." Betty's protective instincts flared. "He's only 6. I understand. And we'll be gentle. There are child psychologists who specialize in this kind of testimony. They know how to ask questions without causing additional trauma. But Sean's perspective is valuable. He witnessed years of abuse. His voice matters. Can I be there during the interview? Absolutely. We wouldn't do it any other way." The interview took place 2 weeks later, in a room designed to look nothing like a legal setting. Comfortable couches, soft lighting, toys scattered across a carpet that featured cartoon animals. The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, had a warm smile and a gentle manner that immediately put Sean at ease. Betty sat in the corner, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to let Sean speak freely. Anthony waited in the hallway, pacing with the restless energy of someone who wanted to fix things but knew this wasn't his battle to fight. "Sean," Dr. Huang began, "do you know why we're here today?" Sean nodded seriously. "We're going to talk about the bad man. My mummy said it's okay to tell the truth about what happened." "That's right. And I want you to know that you're not in any trouble. Nothing that happened was your fault. We just want to understand what life was like before you moved to your new apartment." What followed was 45 minutes of careful questioning that made Betty's heart break and swell with pride simultaneously. Sean described the hiding, the noise, the times when Mummy cried and Daddy yelled. He explained about Gerald the elephant being his protector during the scary nights. He talked about learning to call 911, practicing the numbers over and over until he knew them by heart. "And can you tell me about the night you made that call?" Dr. Huang asked. Sean's face grew solemn. It was worse than usual. "Daddy found something on Mummy's computer and he got really angry. I heard glass breaking and Mummy screaming. She told me to hide, like she always does. But I knew this time was different. I knew if I didn't do something, Mummy might not be okay in the morning. That was very brave of you, Sean. I was scared. But Mummy taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Betty wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the wisdom coming from her 6-year-old son. She'd taught him that. In the midst of all the chaos and fear, she'd managed to give him something good. Something lasting. And then what happened? I called the number and a lady answered. She asked me questions and I told her our address, just like Mummy practiced with me. And then Anthony's voice came on. He said he was coming. He promised. And did he keep his promise? Sean smiled for the first time since the interview began. He came. He fought the bad man and made him stop. And then he stayed. He's been staying ever since. He's my dad now. Dr. Huang glanced at Betty, a question in her eyes. Betty nodded slightly. That's wonderful, Sean. It sounds like you have people who love you very much. I do. Sean's voice was matter-of-fact. My mummy and my dad and Gerald. We're a family now. A real one, not a scary one. The interview concluded shortly after. Dr. Huang escorted them to the hallway, where Anthony was still pacing. He did beautifully, Dr. Huang assured them. His testimony will be powerful. The jury will understand exactly what kind of household he was living in and why intervention was necessary. Thank you, Betty said, for being so gentle with him. Children are resilient, Dr. Huang replied. More resilient than we give them credit for. But they need to be believed. That's the most important thing you can give a child who's witnessed trauma. Believe them when they tell you something was wrong. They left the interview room and drove home in contemplative silence. Sean fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional labor of recounting his story. Betty stared out the window, watching the city pass, lost in thought. You okay? Anthony asked, reaching over to rest his hand on her knee. I think so. It's strange, hearing him describe our life like that. Like a story about someone else, but also knowing it was real, that he lived through all of it. You both survived. That's what matters. We more than survived. Betty turned to look at him. We found you. I found you, Anthony corrected. Or Sean did. Either way, I'm the lucky one. The trial was scheduled for 3 months after Victor's second arrest. The legal team prepared them thoroughly, walking through potential questions, practicing responses, helping them understand the rhythm of courtroom procedure. Betty threw herself into the preparation with the same determination she'd applied to rebuilding her life. But amidst the legal chaos, there was also joy. Anthony had, at some point that neither of them could precisely identify, moved in. His clothes appeared in Betty's closet. His coffee mug claimed permanent residence by the sink. His presence became so woven into the fabric of their daily life that his absence felt wrong. We should probably talk about this, Betty said one morning, finding him making pancakes while Sean set the table. Talk about what? The fact that you basically live here now. Anthony flipped a pancake with practiced ease. I can get my own place if you want. I didn't mean to presume. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we should acknowledge it, make it official somehow. Anthony set down the spatula and turned to face her. Betty Hill, are you asking me to move in with you? I think I'm acknowledging that you already have. And I'm saying I don't want that to change. Anthony smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made Betty's heart flutter in ways she'd thought she'd never feel again. Then I guess I'm officially moved in. Sean looked up from his table-setting duties. Does this mean you're staying forever? Anthony crouched down to Sean's level. I hope so, buddy. I really hope so. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, wood-paneled walls and a judge's bench that seemed designed to dwarf anyone who stood before it. Betty wore a navy blue dress, professional and understated. Anthony sat behind her in the gallery, close enough that she could feel his presence without turning around. Victor was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He'd lost weight in prison, but his eyes still held the same cold rage that had haunted Betty's nightmares for years. When he saw her, he smiled, and every survival instinct she'd developed screamed at her to run. But she didn't run. She sat in her seat and met his gaze and let him see that she wasn't afraid anymore. The prosecution went first. Prosecutor Torres laid out the case with methodical precision, presenting evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. Medical records documenting Betty's injuries over 5 years. Police reports from calls that had been made and then recanted when Victor convinced Betty to tell officers it was a misunderstanding. The 911 call where Sean's terrified voice begged for someone to save his mother. When Sean's recorded interview was played for the jury, several members wiped their eyes. The child's voice, so small and serious, describing hiding in closets and covering his ears and counting to 100 while the bad things happened, was more powerful than any adult testimony could be. Then it was Betty's turn. She walked to the witness stand feeling like she was moving through water. Every step was deliberate, every breath conscious. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then she sat down and faced 12 strangers who would decide whether her suffering was valid enough to warrant justice. "Miss Hill," Prosecutor Torres began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant?" Betty took a breath. "I met Victor 6 years ago. At first, he was charming and attentive. He made me feel special, seen. The abuse started gradually. Small things at first. Criticism of my appearance, isolation from my friends, controlling behavior around money and decisions. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward and promised it would never happen again. I believed him. And did it happen again? Many times. Over 5 years, the violence escalated. Pushing became hitting. Hitting became punching. The night of the 911 call, I truly believed he was going to kill me. What was different about that night? He found apartment listings on my computer. I'd been secretly looking for a way out, planning an escape. When he discovered that, he lost control completely. I knew I might not survive. Can you describe your injuries from that night? Broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, multiple contusions to my face and body. And your son witnessed this? Not directly. I sent him to hide, like I always did during the violent episodes, but he heard everything. He always heard everything. The defense attorney's cross-examination was exactly what Prosecutor Torres had warned about. He tried to suggest that Betty had provoked Victor, that her secret apartment hunting was a betrayal that any man would find upsetting. He implied that she had exaggerated her injuries, that she was using the legal system to gain sympathy and resources. But Betty held firm. Every accusation she countered with facts. Every insinuation she rejected with calm clarity. She was not the woman who had cowered in that kitchen, praying for survival. She was the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and no defense attorney was going to tear that down. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt lighter than she had in years. The truth was out. Her story had been told. Whatever happened next, she had done everything in her power to ensure Victor faced consequences. Anthony testified next, describing his involvement through the Hope Foundation, the night of the rescue, and the attack at the park. His testimony was calm and precise, the facts speaking for themselves. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth about what he'd witnessed and what he'd been forced to do in response. The defense tried to paint him as a meddler, a wealthy man, inserting himself into a domestic situation for ego or publicity. But Anthony's answers never wavered. "I responded to a child's call for help," he said simply. Any decent person would have done the same. The trial lasted 5 days. Both sides presented their cases, called their witnesses, made their arguments. Then it was up to the jury. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Betty sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, tears streaming down her face, Anthony's hand gripping hers so tightly it almost hurt. Guilty of assault causing bodily harm. Guilty of domestic violence. Guilty of violating a restraining order. Guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a woman who had spent 30 years on the bench, looked at Victor with something approaching contempt. "Mr. Rollins," she said, "the evidence presented in this case paints a picture of sustained, calculated cruelty. You terrorized your wife and child for years. When given the opportunity to change, to seek help, to address the darkness within you, you instead chose to escalate. You attempted to harm the very people you claimed to love. This court has no tolerance for such behavior. Victor stood at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched, his eyes still radiating defiance. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole. Additionally, upon your release, you will be subject to a lifetime restraining order. You will have no contact with Betty Hill or Sean Hill, directly or indirectly, for the remainder of your natural life. Is that understood? Victor said nothing. His lawyer nudged him. Yes. Victor finally ground out. Understood. The judge nodded. Then we are adjourned. It was over. Truly over. Betty turned to Anthony and buried her face in his chest, sobbing with relief and release and the overwhelming realization that she was finally completely free. In the gallery behind them, Sean sat with Elena, who had accompanied him to the sentencing hearing. When the verdict was announced, Sean didn't cry or cheer. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd always known. The bad man is going away for real this time, he asked Elena. For a very long time, Elena confirmed. Good. Sean's voice was matter of fact. Now we can be a regular family, without any more scary parts. The months that followed the trial were, in many ways, the most ordinary of Betty's life. And that ordinariness felt miraculous. She went to work every day at the advocacy center, helping other survivors navigate the system she'd been helped through. She came home to an apartment that felt like a real home, filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. She cooked dinner with Anthony while Sean did homework at the kitchen table, complaining about math problems while secretly loving the challenge. The nightmares faded, replaced by dreams about the future. The hypervigilance softened, allowing her to relax in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The woman who had spent 5 years surviving finally started living. Anthony was transforming too. The driven, guarded billionaire who had used work to escape his grief was becoming someone different. Someone who left the office early to attend Sean's school plays. Someone who took weekends off to build increasingly elaborate Lego structures with his son. Someone who laughed easily and loved freely and no longer seemed haunted by the sister he couldn't save. He'd started talking about Miranda more often, sharing memories with Betty and Sean, keeping her present in their lives in a way that felt healthy rather than painful. She would have loved you both, he said one evening, looking at a photo of Miranda that now had a place of honor in their living room. She always wanted a family. Kids, chaos, the whole thing. She never got to have it, but I like to think she's watching. I like to think she knows that something good came out of all that loss. Tell me about her, Sean requested. He'd become fascinated by the aunt he'd never met, the reason his father had come into their lives. She was funny, Anthony said, and brave, and terrible at cooking, but convinced she was great at it. I once ate an entire plate of burnt spaghetti, just to avoid hurting her feelings. That's love, Betty observed. That's love, Anthony agreed. Now, before we reach the end of this story, I need to pause one final time and speak directly to you. We've traveled a long road together, from a child's terrified whisper into a phone to a family standing in their living room, talking about love and loss and the strange paths that lead us to where we belong. This story was never just about rescue. It was about what happens after, the slow, unglamorous, beautiful work of rebuilding. The choice to trust again after trust has been shattered. The discovery that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant for, and that's okay. That's more than okay. If you've been watching this from your own place of pain, from your own metaphorical closet where you're waiting for someone to come, I need you to know something. You are not alone. You are not broken. And help is possible, even when it seems impossible. If you've been watching as someone who has answered calls, who has shown up for others, who has tried to be the rescue that someone else needed, I need you to know something too. Your efforts matter. Every time you show up, every time you keep a promise, you're changing the course of someone's story. If this journey has meant something to you, I'm asking you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. It's such a small action, but it helps this story reach others who need to hear it. Share this video. You never know who in your life is hiding their own pain, waiting for permission to believe that things can get better. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson's Stories. We're building something here, a community of people who believe in second chances, in redemption, in the radical idea that love can exist without violence. And drop a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me if you've been Betty, fighting for survival. Tell me if you've been Anthony, carrying guilt and searching for purpose. Tell me if you've been Sean, brave enough to ask for help even when you didn't know if anyone would answer. Your voice matters. Your story matters. You matter. Now, Let's see how this story ends. The proposal happened on a Sunday morning, 11 months after the rescue. It wasn't planned, at least not consciously, but perhaps, in the ways that mattered, Anthony had been planning it since the moment Sean's voice came through that phone line, since the moment he decided to answer a call that would change everything. They were in the kitchen, their kitchen, making pancakes. This had become their Sunday ritual, a tradition born from the chaos of those first weeks when structure and routine were the only things holding them together. Now it was simply something they did because they loved it, because it was theirs. Sean was at the table, carefully constructing a tower from butter packets, fully absorbed in his architectural endeavor. Betty was whisking batter, wearing one of Anthony's old shirts and looking more beautiful than anyone had a right to look before 9 a.m. And Anthony, standing at the stove, flipping pancakes onto a plate, felt something shift in his chest. Not the crack of pain he'd grown accustomed to over the years, but something different, something expansive, something that felt a lot like certainty. Betty. She didn't look up from the batter. Marry me. She stopped whisking. Sean looked up from his butter tower. The kitchen went very quiet. What? I know we haven't talked about this. I know it's sudden. And I know you have every reason to be cautious about marriage after everything you went through. Anthony set down the spatula and turned to face her fully. But I love you. I love Sean. I love this life we're building together. And I want to make it official. I want you to be my wife. I want to be Sean's father in every legal and binding way possible. I want the world to know that this family is real. Betty's eyes were filling with tears, but she was smiling. The pan with the half-cooked pancake was starting to smoke, but neither of them moved toward it. Anthony Ward, she said, are you proposing to me in your underwear, surrounded by breakfast foods? Anthony looked down at himself. Boxers, a worn t-shirt, bare feet. Not exactly the romantic scenario he might have imagined. I guess I am. Is that a problem? Betty laughed, the sound bright and free and full of joy. No, it's perfect. It's completely, absolutely perfect. Is that a yes? Sean interrupted before Betty could answer. She's supposed to say yes. That's how it works in the movies. And then you kiss, and there's music and everyone's happy. Betty walked over to Anthony and took his face in her hands, looking into his eyes with an intensity that made his heart stop. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want this family to be real. Yes to everything, Anthony. Yes to all of it. The kiss that followed was interrupted by Sean making exaggerated gagging noises, which made them both laugh. The pancake burned beyond salvaging. The morning devolved into chaos and joy, and the particular kind of beautiful mess that comes with having a 6-year-old involved in your romantic moments. Later, after they'd managed to produce a batch of actually edible pancakes, they sat at the table together, discussing what came next. I want a ring, Betty announced. Nothing expensive. I don't care about carats or settings. Just something that means something. I'll find the perfect one, Anthony promised. And I want a small wedding, she continued. Just people who matter. No society photographers or business associates. Family and friends who've been part of our story. Whatever you want. And Sean should have a role. A real role, not just sitting in the audience. He can be the best man, Anthony suggested. Or the ring bearer, or both. Can I be both? Sean asked, perking up. That's like double the job. If you think you can handle it. Sean puffed out his chest with the confidence of someone who had faced down monsters and lived to tell the tale. I can definitely handle it. The wedding planning took 3 months, which felt both too long and not long enough. They chose a venue that had personal significance, the courtyard of the transitional housing facility where Betty and Sean had first found safety. The foundation had given them permission to use the space, and several staff members were invited as guests. Betty's mother, Margaret, came from Ohio to help with preparations. She'd been wary of Anthony at first, protective of her daughter after everything she'd been through. But watching him with Sean, seeing the way he looked at Betty, she'd softened. He's a good man, she told her daughter one evening, as they sorted through invitation responses. Not like the other one. I know, Mama. I'm not making the same mistake twice. I never thought you'd make it the first time. You were always so smart, so capable. I couldn't understand how you ended up with someone like Victor. Betty was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I think that's part of how it happens, she said finally. You're smart, so you think you'll see it coming. You're capable, so you think you can fix it. By the time you realize the truth, you're already trapped. But you got out. With help. A lot of help. And one very brave 5-year-old who picked up a phone. Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. I'm proud of you, Betty. Prouder than I've ever been of anyone. What you survived, what you built afterward, the woman you've become. Your father would be so proud. I think about him a lot, Betty admitted. Especially now with Anthony. Dad was the kind of man who ran toward danger to save people. Anthony is the same way. They would have understood each other. They would have been friends, Margaret agreed. And Thomas would have given Anthony the same speech I'm going to give him at dinner tonight. What speech? The "if you hurt my daughter, they'll never find the body" speech. Margaret's eyes twinkled. I've been practicing. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in May, when the courtyard was in full bloom and the spring air carried the scent of new beginnings. The guest list was small, maybe 50 people, but every single one of them had played a role in the journey that led to this moment. Elena was there, wiping tears before the ceremony even started. Prosecutor Torres attended with her wife. Several families who had been helped by the Hope Foundation sat in the back rows, witnesses to the good that could come from the worst circumstances. Anthony's mother, Marguerite, occupied a seat of honor in the front row. She'd flown in from New York the week before, spending time with Betty and Sean, getting to know the family her son had found. You're good for him, she told Betty during one of their conversations. He was lost for so long after Miranda. I thought I'd never see him smile again, not really smile. But with you, with Sean, he's found something I thought was gone forever. He's good for us too, Betty replied. He gave us our lives back. You gave each other that, Marguerite corrected. That's how it should be. The ceremony itself was simple and sincere. Anthony wore a charcoal gray suit that made his eyes look even darker. Betty wore a dress of ivory and lace, simple but elegant, chosen because it made her feel beautiful without trying too hard. Sean wore a matching charcoal suit, adjusted to fit his 6-year-old frame, and carried both the rings and the weight of his dual responsibility with extreme seriousness. The officiant was a friend of Elena's, someone who had performed numerous ceremonies for survivors starting new chapters. She spoke about resilience and hope, about the courage it takes to love again after love has been weaponized against you. Then it was time for the vows. Anthony went first. Betty, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. 11 months ago, I answered a phone call that changed my life. But the truth is, you and Sean are the ones who answered something in me, something I'd been trying to ignore for years. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I spent 4 years after Miranda died believing that I didn't deserve happiness. I'd failed her, so I didn't get to have the things she never got to have. Family, love, a home that felt like more than just a place to sleep. I built an empire to distract myself, but I was empty inside. And then your son called for help and everything changed. You didn't just give me a chance to save someone. You gave me a chance to be saved. Your strength, your resilience, your refusal to be defined by what was done to you, it showed me that redemption was possible, that people could survive the worst and still choose love. I promise to spend the rest of my life deserving the trust you've placed in me. I promise to show up every day, even when it's hard. I promise to be the father Sean deserves and the husband you deserve. I promise to love you, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's not. You are my family. You are my home. And I will never stop being grateful that I answered that call. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtyard. Even Sean, who had been fidgeting slightly during the speeches, was still. Betty took a breath and began her vows. Anthony, for 5 years I believed that love meant pain. That care came with conditions, that the best I could hope for was survival. I'd stopped dreaming about anything beyond getting through each day without more damage. Then you walked into my kitchen in the middle of the worst night of my life, and you fought for us. You didn't know us. You had no obligation to help. But you came because a child asked you to, and you stayed because that's who you are. You taught me that men could be gentle without being weak. That strength could protect instead of destroy. That love didn't have to leave bruises. She paused, wiping her eyes. I promise to love you with my whole heart, not the guarded peace I've been protecting, but all of it. I promise to trust you, even when trust is terrifying. I promise to build a life with you that neither of us imagined possible a year ago. You answered a call you didn't have to answer. Now I'm answering one too. I'm choosing you, Anthony. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing to believe that happily ever after is possible, even for people like us who had to fight for every happy moment. The officiant smiled through her own tears. Do we have the rings? Sean stepped forward, his face serious with responsibility. He'd practiced this moment a dozen times, and he executed it perfectly, handing the rings over with the gravity of someone transferring nuclear launch codes. Then it was time for Sean's contribution, his idea, something he'd insisted on during the planning. I want to make promises too, he'd said. Anthony's making promises to Mummy, and Mummy's making promises to Anthony. But they're both making promises to me, right? So I should make promises back. They'd let him write his own words, helping only with spelling and punctuation. Sean cleared his throat and unfolded a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I, Sean Hill, promise to share my Mummy with Anthony, even when I want her all to myself. I promise to let Anthony help me with homework, even though I like when Mummy does it better. I promise to call him Dad for real, not just sometimes when I forget. He looked up from his paper, meeting Anthony's eyes. I promise to be a good son. Not perfect, because Mummy says nobody's perfect. But good, the kind of son that makes you glad you answered the phone that night. Anthony blinked rapidly, clearly fighting tears. Come here, buddy, he said, voice rough. Sean abandoned his position as ring bearer and ran to Anthony, who scooped him up into a hug that included Betty somehow, all three of them wrapped together in front of everyone who mattered. The officiant laughed gently. I think we can consider the vows complete. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, and family. The reception was held in the same courtyard, tables set up among the flowering bushes, fairy lights strung overhead as evening approached. There was food and music and dancing, all the traditional elements of celebration, but infused with a particular sweetness that came from knowing how close they'd come to never having this at all. Marguerite gave a speech that made everyone cry. My daughter Miranda, she said, would have loved this day. She would have loved Betty's strength and Sean's spirit and the way my son has finally learned to live instead of just existing. For years after she died, I wondered if Anthony would ever find his way back to happiness. Today, I have my answer. She raised her glass. To Miranda, who watches over us still. To Betty and Sean, who brought my son back to life. And to love, which finds a way even through the darkest nights. The party continued late into the evening. Sean fell asleep in a corner eventually, curled up with Gerald the elephant on a pile of jackets. Betty and Anthony danced slowly in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the people who had helped them reach this moment. Are you happy? Anthony murmured into her hair. More than I knew was possible, Betty replied. Are you? I think I finally understand what that word means. Happy, really happy, not just the absence of pain. This is what Miranda wanted for me, what I wanted for her. I just wish she could be here to see it. She is, Betty said. I really believe that. She's part of everything good that came from losing her. Every family the foundation has helped. Every person who answered a call they didn't have to answer. That's her legacy. Anthony pulled back slightly to look at her face. How did I get so lucky? You showed up, Betty said simply. That's all any of us can do. Show up, keep showing up, and trust that eventually it leads somewhere good. The first anniversary of their wedding fell on a Saturday, exactly 2 years after the night of the rescue. They celebrated with pancakes, as had become their tradition, and a trip to the butterfly pavilion that Sean had been requesting for months. Sean was 7 now, tall for his age and increasingly interested in how things were built. His bedroom in their new house, a proper house with a backyard and room for the family to grow, was covered with blueprints and sketches and models of increasingly complex structures. Dad, he said, using the word casually now, naturally, the way he'd always said Mummy. Can we go to the building museum next weekend? They have a new exhibit about skyscrapers. Of course, Anthony replied. We can make a day of it. Betty watched them from the kitchen doorway, her heart full in ways she still sometimes couldn't believe. This was her life now. Pancakes and museum trips and a husband who built Lego towers with their son. Ordinary, beautiful, hard-won normalcy. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, lying on a kitchen floor, certain she was going to die. She thought about the child who had picked up a phone and asked strangers to save his mother. She thought about the man who had answered, who had shown up, who had stayed. Every year on this date, they lit a candle for Miranda. It sat on the mantelpiece beside the family photos, a reminder that their happiness had been born from someone else's loss. Sean understood, in the way children understand complicated things, that his dad had a sister who died, and that's why he worked so hard to help other families. What would she think of us? Sean asked this year, staring at the candle's flame. I think she'd be happy, Anthony said. I think she'd say that her baby brother finally figured out what matters. Does she watch us? Like a ghost? I don't know, buddy. Maybe. Or maybe she's just part of everything good we try to do. Every time we help someone, every time we show up for each other, maybe that's her living on. Sean considered this for a moment. I'm going to build a building for her someday. A really big one. With her name on it. Anthony's eyes glistened. She'd like that. The foundation continued to grow. Betty had taken on a leadership role, overseeing the advocacy program and personally working with survivors who reminded her of herself. Her face appeared on awareness campaigns now. I survived. You can too. She spoke at conferences and testified before legislative committees and told her story so many times that it became just that, a story, something that had happened to her but no longer defined her. And somewhere, in a prison cell that he would occupy for many years to come, Victor Rollins faded into irrelevance. Betty no longer feared him. She no longer even thought about him, except occasionally when a new survivor would describe their abuser and she'd recognize the pattern, the charm followed by control followed by violence. He has no power anymore, she would tell them. None of them do. Not once you're free. The future stretched out before them, full of ordinary challenges and extraordinary love. There would be difficult days, arguments about household responsibilities, and disagreements about parenting approaches, and all the normal friction that comes with sharing a life. But underneath all of it, there was a foundation, a family built from the rubble of trauma, stronger for having been broken. On the morning of their second anniversary, Anthony woke early, as he often did. He slipped out of bed without waking Betty, and padded down the hallway to Sean's room, where his son was still sleeping, Gerald the elephant tucked under one arm. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of Sean's breathing, remembering a night that felt like a lifetime ago. A child's voice on the phone, a promise made to a stranger, a choice that had led to everything. Thank you, he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was thanking. Miranda, the universe, the part of himself that had decided to answer instead of ignore. Thank you for giving me this. He went downstairs to start the coffee, and by the time Betty joined him, Sean trailing behind in search of pancakes, the kitchen was warm with the smell of brewing coffee and the promise of another ordinary, extraordinary day. Dad? Sean asked, climbing onto his usual stool. Can you tell me the story again? About the night you came to save us? You've heard it 100 times, buddy. I know, but I like how it ends. Anthony smiled, pouring batter onto the griddle. How does it end? Sean's face was completely serious. It ends with us, being a family. Forever. Anthony looked at Betty across the kitchen. She was smiling, tears in her eyes, beautiful in the morning light. Yeah, buddy, he said softly. That's exactly how it ends. And so we come to the end of this story. But really, it's not an end at all. It's a beginning, the kind of beginning that only comes after surviving an ending you thought would destroy you. Betty found her strength. Anthony found his purpose. Sean found his family. And somewhere, watching over all of them, Miranda's memory lives on in every call that gets answered, every promise that gets kept, every person who decides to show up when someone else needs them. This is what I want you to take from this story. Not just the drama or the romance or the happy ending. I want you to remember that help is possible, that people can change, that the worst night of your life can lead to the best chapter of your story. If you're hiding in your own metaphorical closet right now, waiting for someone to come, I want you to know that someone will. Maybe it's already happening. Maybe the person who answers your call hasn't entered your life yet, but they will. Hold on. If you're in a position to be someone's rescue, to answer a call that isn't convenient, to show up for a stranger because it's the right thing to do, I want you to know that your efforts matter more than you will ever understand. You might be the beginning of someone's happily ever after. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing in stories that remind us what's possible. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson Stories for more narratives that prove love is worth fighting for. And remember, somewhere out there, someone is calling for help. Someone is waiting for a person brave enough to answer. Maybe that person is you. Until next time, this is Mr. Dawson Stories, reminding you that some calls change everything. Make sure you answer.